Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world, and welcome to another installment from Lean Focus, an installment in our monthly webinar series. The topic for today's webinar is Overcoming Supply Chain Interruptions with Supplier Risk Assessment and Mitigation Best Practices. My name is Damon Baker, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. In a moment, I have the distinct pleasure to introduce you to Rob Grumski, who is the Vice President of the Lean Focus Procurement Transformation Practice. Next slide, please. This information is proprietary and confidential. For those of you that are unable to make the webinar, a recorded version of today's session will be made available to you in an email. Please do check your spam folder just in case you are unable to receive it. And those that have taken part live today will also receive the same email with a link to the video recording as well. That recording will be made available on our website a few days later and can be accessed at your own leisure in a future time. Next slide. So throughout the presentation today, the participants will be placed in listen-only mode. In the control panel are some handouts. There are 3 handouts that can be downloaded during today's presentation. One is an overview of the procurement transformation practice and what our service offering is. Another attachment is a self-assessment that you can use to assess your procurement function within your organization to determine what the gaps are against best practices in the industry. And the third attachment is related to the topic of this webinar. It is a supplier risk management process that you can employ to install this process inside of your company to ensure that you de-risk your supply chain. Questions will be answered at the end of today's webinar. There is a panel inside of the GoToWebinar toolbox that you can type your questions, and I will read those questions aloud to the speaker at the end of today's webinar, and we will allot some time at the end of today's session, so please type those in. And as I mentioned earlier, this recording will be made available to you both on our website and will be sent in the form of an email attachment one day after today's webinar, and to check your spam folder if you have not received it. So without further ado, let me introduce you to today's speaker, Rob Grumski, who will share a little bit about his background. Rob?
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me today in today's webinar. My name is Rob Grumski. I've had multiple senior level positions with many different segments of industry, including medical devices, high-tech manufacturing, heavy machinery manufacturing, and mining machinery equipment. I have a master's degree from the University of Auburn, as well as a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Cincinnati. So on today's webinar, we're going to talk about a number of topics related to supply chain risk and how to overcome them. And if you think about supply chain risk and how to overcome it, it is really about being proactive in how to address this big business issue that certainly has come alive here most recently, but has been with us for some time. So in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the Lean Focus Procurement Practice, just a brief introduction of that. Then we're going to go through some supplier risk assessment methodology, how to calculate supply risk and mitigation strategies. A big one is preparing for supplier disruptions. And then we're going to talk about some of the hidden benefits of a supply risk program for organizations. And then lastly, I have a case study that I will review and kind of give an idea of what the power of really having a well-oiled supply risk management program in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Lean Focus and procurement practice. But before I do that, just an overview of Lean Focus itself. It's really about building high-performance team that incorporates driven leaders through guiding principles of Lean and really following those principles and using proven systems that we have proprietary in our toolbox that provide proven results. But more specifically, when you talk about our procurement practice, we look at the procurement practice as taking the power that's in procurement and unleashing it and allowing procurement to become a very important and value-added function within the organization, helping to drive and reduce supply chain risk, accelerating procurement in-year savings, and improving quality, cost, and delivery from our supply base. We've helped many companies in very large, very small, and in multiple segments to be transformed through our Lean principles and processes. So let me talk a little bit more about our procurement transportation model. We focus on 8 pillars within procurement to help companies improve the importance of procurement and the value that it can add. And these 8 include people, policies and government, commodity strategies, new opportunity sourcing or new product sourcing, performance KPIs, procurement tools, project management, and what we're going to talk a lot about today is supplier risk management. And the key here is we really focus on the levers that drive value creation. Okay, so let's dive into what is supply risk management and the methodology in order to do risk assessments. In general, there are 2 types or 2 categories of assessment methodology. There is the broad approach that really looks across all your supply base, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then there's the focused approach, which really you're only focusing on maybe your largest and most critical suppliers to get a deeper understanding of where potential supply risk may exist. So when you think of the broad approach, it does have some positives because you are looking at all suppliers in the same way, in some way, meaning that you may look across all your suppliers and feed that information to say a third-party provider like Dun & Bradstreet or there's several others that can then provide you back a financial score or something related to the condition of that supplier. Unfortunately, this typically only gives you a high-level view and doesn't necessarily look more into how that supplier could affect your company particularly and the given risks that they may have as well. The other negatives or downside of doing a broad approach is you get a lot of feedback, and so it may be much more difficult to prioritize your mitigation actions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in future slides, but mitigation actions can be very expensive, can be very time consuming to do them right. And so you really need to prioritize on which ones are going to provide you the biggest bang for your buck, of course. Lastly, it really isn't providing, let's say, that cross-functional input. Having a cross-functional input into your supply base is very fundamentally positive in several ways, and when you don't have that, it can be a negative as well. On the good side of this, the assessment is pretty much automated. Again, you can typically provide a list of suppliers to a third party, or if you have the software yourself, run it through and get that kind of feedback of, a financial score or something along those lines. Now, when we talk about a focused approach, we're really only looking at our largest and most critical suppliers to be assessed. And the reason we do this is that it really gives you a much more in-depth of your risks that the supplier can bring, and also what the internal impacts may have on your organization. It helps you have a clear priority for mitigation action because, again, you're not assessing 1,000 or so suppliers. It really should be somewhere between 20 and 30, and maybe a few more, but somewhere in that range. And then lastly, but also more important, is driving cross-functional involvement. Having your operations team, your finance team, your engineering team, all understanding where supply risk is possible, where it's coming from, will certainly help you in procurement and the broader company to better be prepared for risk and have less of a roadblock when trying to mitigate risk. I would say that neither is perfect. Neither approach is perfect in its entirety. But I do believe that focused approach, when you're looking at your top suppliers, your biggest suppliers that cover most of your revenue, and those critical suppliers, and what I mean by the critical suppliers is something that maybe you don't spend a lot of money on, but it's in every one of your products that you build. For example, if you think about if you're baking a cake, you know, it's the salt in the cake batter. You may only use just a sprinkling of that for the whole cake, but it is critical, and if you leave it out, it causes you not to be able to produce. So now that we have a methodology on how we're going to look at our suppliers, now we have to figure out how are we going to measure supply risk and provide mitigation strategies for the risk that we do measure. So when you think about how do you calculate supply risk, and at first this concept may seem a bit complicated, but in general, it can be made fairly simple and easy to go through. There are three main impacts to supply risk. It's the supplier attributes, what risks they bring, so to speak, what impact it has on the enterprise or your company, and then also the impact of the revenue that supply risk may affect. And what I call, if you add those up, it equals your basically supply risk revenue score. Now, when you look at the supply risk attributes, these are many items, and you know, not all are critical to each supplier and or situation within your company. But it's important that, you know, as a cross-functional team, you would evaluate this and then come up with a scoring and weighting scheme to gauge each one of these attributes. Typically, you would score from 0, 1, 3, or 5, and 5 being the highest risk, 0 being no risk, and then have definitions for each of the other scoring numbers that allow you to be repeatable in how you score supplier attributes. Then you would multiply that by, for each supplier, the enterprise impact. And again, perhaps not all of these pertain to every situation, and certainly it can be customizable. But you know, you're going to be looking at what is the percent of the overall revenue that maybe that supplier impacts. You know, what would be the customer dissatisfaction? Can that customer quickly stop using your product, go to another product, and then come back once you can supply again? If he can, then the risk would be low. If it would be very difficult for that customer to go through a long qualification period, then your risk would be high. Another example I show down here is compliance. You know, not all industries have compliance or regulatory impacts, but in some cases, if you have a defense-related contract or a medical-related contract, there could be regulatory or compliance implications that could have higher risk for a given supplier versus others. And then multiplying that by the revenue that that particular supplier impacts, again, would provide you a score that is repeatable time and time again. And so it's now you have a meaningful, comprehensive value that you can prioritize, and more importantly, you can track it and see if in fact you are reducing risk over time. And that's really the goal of any risk strategy. So now let's talk a little bit about supply risk mitigation. Mitigation is a proactive way to help you reduce risk. It's not dealing with, I have an issue today, but if something were to occur, what could I do to help lessen the impact on the business or reduce it altogether? And there are many possible actions to build risk mitigation plans. There's external, and those external kinds of mitigation plans include, making sure your supplier actually has a disaster recovery plan. If they don't, then you may want to help them create that for, whether that be a natural disaster or geopolitical or something along those lines. Having a strong supply agreement in place that if something were to occur, you're first in line, or they have a way to move it to, buy from their competitor or things along those lines. You can also have the supplier own safety inventory. A very simple way to do that, but certainly there's a cost involved there. And then there might be other external strategies you may look at as well. Internally, if you're looking at supply mitigation as well, there's kind of part B of this. What can you do internally to help reduce risk for a given supplier? Obviously, maybe you acquire that supplier and it becomes part of your organization, and you find ways to mitigate that risk that way. You add additional inventory, qualifying second or even third parties or third sources of suppliers, can help mitigate risk as well. You may look to insource, and again, there could be a multitude of other things, and not one solution is good for every company or every situation. So that's why it's really good to have that cross-functional team talk through, what is the cost, what is the impact potential by doing something, and then also what is the time involved to get it done as well. So when you think about this, doing the assessment as well as putting together risk mitigation plans, as I talk about this, typically, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, as a kickstart, we could probably do this for you in about 5 days in a very dedicated Kaizen type of event. But once you were up and running, the process and the timing example that I have used in many organizations that I've worked for is really kind of strung out through the year. And it's an ongoing thing where in the first part or first quarter of the year, you would be doing your supplier risk assessments and calculating that SRRS score. Secondly, in quarter 2, you would start to create the mitigation plans. And then in quarter 3, quarter 4, you would start to implement. Because let's face it, any of these actions or most of these actions take many more months than just a 1 month or 2. It could be as much as 6 months or more before you're fully implemented on a really robust mitigation plan. And of course, this is not a one and done process. This has to be done, year after year, financial year after financial year, or however you want to, your repetition of it. But things change, as we all know. Suppliers change, our business change, your businesses change, environments within the geopolitical world change. So it's very important that this is an ongoing, living, breathing process that really has no end, because things do change. So now let's talk a little bit about supplier disruptions. And supplier disruptions are things that occur that could be related to a number of different things. And so, if you think about it, it could be natural disaster, it could be, a war, it could be labor shortages or labor disruption with strikes and things along those lines. And so, when you think about that, there are some really basic ideas or concepts around, what do I do if my supplier of X stops supplying me today? I just found out today they can't supply anymore. So what should I have, or what should I have included in this plan? And the key really is to be first in line. And my experience has shown in many cases over my career, when we were able to be first in line to approach a supplier that had an issue and secure that place in line to get product when they are back up and running was critical. So, some really basic things, but understanding who those senior level information, including phone numbers and email addresses. I can't tell you how many times there have been, witness of companies where they've had an issue and oh, the buyer in Milwaukee has that information and deals with that supplier, and really no one else has the contact information. And again, it may take days sometimes to get that information because that person's on vacation. Ownership structure, understanding what their ownership structure is, having a copy of their disaster recovery plan so that you can understand the steps they're taking and how you might be able to assist them to get back up and running quickly. Again, may seem simple, but all production and warehouse locations, understanding that, hey, maybe they had a fire at this location, but can we ship that production over to another location? If it's a manufacturer, understanding where all their stocking distributor contact information is. Again, I've had several situations where I've been able to contact, I would buy from the manufacturer direct, and they were having an issue. I could go to a stocking distributor and pull inventory that helped me bridge the gap until the manufacturer was up and running again. Here's some interesting ones that I think is alternative approved suppliers, knowing who they are up front, having it in that document so there's no question on who to place orders on next. I can tell you, especially they may not be a primary supplier. If there is something that occurs to a light supplier and they know they're going to get additional business, they might be choosy on who they actually accept purchase orders from. So it's really important then to be first in line to make sure that maybe you're even ahead of their knowledge of the supply problem. And then, having who the potential suppliers are is really important, because, a lot of times you may not have approved suppliers, secondary suppliers, but you need to know who to go to. And having those, again, documented and in a document that allows for that reaction to take place is really, really important. And then, last but not least, any potential and approved substitutions. Again, the list may seem somewhat rudimentary, but I can't tell you, how many situations where I have seen where, suppliers, manufacturers don't have this information right at hand, and it takes them sometimes, more than hours, days, and even weeks sometimes to really come back with, what am I going to do next, as opposed to being able to do it within, basically, instantaneously from when the disaster does occur. And, really being able to have that quick reaction and have this kind of information in hand can keep you running until recovery is made. So a little bit on some of the benefits of a supply risk program that might not be, let's say, evident or visible at first glance. So if you think of from a procurement standpoint, there are some other benefits, as I mentioned, to procurement and the procurement team on having a very good supply risk program. Number one is, really improving your knowledge of your largest and most critical suppliers. It goes without saying that sometimes, large suppliers, maybe we've been doing business with them for many, many years, and the people that normally were the contact interface may no longer be there. There could be changes in management and things along those lines. So, having that good knowledge of a supplier, especially your largest, can help you in tough situations. Understanding who their competitors are. Again, seems to be fairly simple, but I can't tell you how many times we went into a situation where we had a supplier that stopped supplying, and you went to and said, well, if we can't buy from them, who do we buy from next? So again, having this information. This is probably, I think, one of the biggest ones here is educating cross-functional stakeholders on potential supply issues. Having that operations director say, geez, if I would have only known that this supplier was this risky, I would have supported finding an alternate. Or if I would have only known that, this supplier had this issue, I would have brought in some more inventory. So having this good stakeholder, cross-functional stakeholder involvement on potential supply issues is really important. And then last but certainly not least is, certainly as procurement folks, we want to try to always find alternate, lower cost, higher quality suppliers. And many times there's a lot of resistance to changing supplies. And so realizing or identifying the risk of a given supplier can really support you in qualifying alternate suppliers. And so, it shouldn't be seen as a real evil of doing supplier risk programs. There is a lot of benefits to it, notwithstanding the reducing risk within your supply base. Excuse me. So just a little bit on a case study. This particular case study is for a medical device company. They were a market-leading supplier of premium products with many global manufacturing locations. They had an initial downturn of revenue as COVID hit in that first 5 to 7 weeks, but then a really strong rebound in the requirement for their products in the marketplace. And so much so that it was really going to be a turning point in the company to allow them to move it to the next level. The challenges that were out there were, it was a highly diverse global supply base, and many of the company's largest suppliers were actually where they were very minor customers. And even though they purchased, a couple million or several $1 million worth of goods, it was a company that was a multi-billion-dollar organization that really saw them as a minor customer. Shortages of raw material, including electronics and other key components. I mean, we all know these kinds of things happened during COVID, and especially, as it wore on. So, one of the things was, the key here was really needing to ensure supply continuity in order to benefit from this revenue rebound. So not only to just continue what was, let's say, status quo for the company, but have some step changes in the amount of revenue they were actually getting because of COVID. So prior to the pandemic occurring, there were several rounds of focused supplier assessment and mitigations and risk mitigation that went on, and it was concentrated on the largest and most critical, impactful supplier using the process. And then really the outcome during the height of the pandemic was really no meaningful supply shortages, resulting only in minor shipment delays. And even during a investor call, a quarterly call with investors, the CEO did mention that how well the supply chain was holding up even during these times of uncertainty. Now, I don't have a slide on this, but I got a call the other day, actually earlier this week, from a friend of mine who is a CEO of a transportation company. And we all know there's well, at least I think we all should know, there's a pending strike in rail. And he said, hey, I see you're putting on this seminar, this webinar on supply risk. Hey, how can you help me with my issue that I might have with this, rail pending work stoppage? And I had to kind of step back a little bit and almost chuckle, because unfortunately he really wasn't getting it. This isn't something that you can sprinkle the pixie dust onto the situation and it, remarkably cures itself. It's called preparation. It's called planning. It's called putting plans and strategies in place that if something were to occur, then you can have a plan for it. And so I went on and I continued to have the discussion with this CEO, and it basically was, around, if rail transportation is a very important part of your business, don't you think you should have a plan that if it shuts down, you can find other ways to move your product? And the question, well, what do you mean? I said, well, think of it. If rail shuts down, trucking companies are going to be probably overwhelmed. So your contracts with your current trucking companies, do you have in place where you can increase your business for whatever reason without them turning it away? Do you have internal resources that you can ramp up quickly in case of something like this? And these were all fairly reflective questions that, honestly, he didn't have the answer for at that time, but he's going to start working on it. And so, these real world things happen all the time. And it's really important that we're not being so reactive to the situation, but running this in a very proactive way. So when we think about some of the next steps and what the best practices and resources are, is as I mentioned before, and I've said it several times, cross-functional team really helps, and including your marketing, sales, finance, manufacturing, engineering, and leading that effort is procurement. And it's so important to have that because, again, as we talked about before, having your entire organization understand the risk and support procurement in either finding new sources or justifying the mitigation is critical. Having it prioritized is really critical because you can't do everything. Honestly, in my view and what I've seen over the last 20 years of doing this, if you put in 3 to 5 mitigation strategies per year, you're doing really well because they typically cost a lot of money and they take a lot of resources to get done. And you have to balance that. So, that's why you may only get to a few every year because there's certainly other things that the enterprise has strategies to do. So, really having that risk reward and understanding where you need to go. And then last but not least, the best practices is having a plan if the disaster occurs for your top and critical suppliers. And, these things don't, again, have to be very complicated, but you should at least know who to talk to, who's the important person within that company that's going to give you the straight story, or when they're going to give you up and running, or how you can help them get back on track. So, some things to think about as you think about your own organization and where you are with supplier risk. Some questions here to ask yourself on, do you regularly perform a focus assessment of your top and most critical suppliers? Do you have a mitigation plans in place for your highest risk suppliers? Are you regularly reviewing your mitigation action plans and the progress to those? Because that's another area where it's really critical. You can do the assessment, and assessments are great, but unless you have a plan in place and you're actually moving to completion of that plan, you're not reducing the risk. Do you have disaster recovery plans in place for your top and critical suppliers? Are you regularly reviewing your supplier disaster recovery plans? That's something that, is, again, not a one and done sort of situation. Things change within each companies that we deal with. Our suppliers change, we change. So we need to keep those updated on a regular basis. And does your supply risk process actively involve your cross-functional senior leaders? Again, really important for you and your teams to have this in place so that they can be, let's say, broadcasted or widely known about what risk may occur. And so if you answered a lot of no's to these questions, or maybe you answered all no's to these questions, we can help. We can schedule a Kaizen workshop. Takes about 5 days, 4.5, 5 days, depending on the scope. And we can put through a process that gets you going on how to do the assessments, how to do the ranking, coming up with the scoring, putting a format together on how to put together risk mitigation strategies and even create a few within the event. Putting together the reaction plans and the project plans to mitigate, to run these, and then creating an SNOP document that basically describes what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and who's going to be involved, and holding yourself to it. And then last but not least, creating a KPI overview that shows and can show the progress that you're making. So those are the things you need to do as we look at that. And again, just as the key deliverables from that 5-day session would be these 8 major items to go through. And it may seem like that's a lot to accomplish in that time frame, but with a focused effort and a cross-functional team, it's very doable, and I've seen it done several times. So with that, I would just like to leave you with this one parting thought here is, from John Kennedy, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And so what I take from this is, the time to negotiate is before a disaster happens. Doing the negotiation or trying to get product after a disaster's happened is going to be very troublesome and very difficult. So I want to thank you all for listening to my webinar and my discussion today. There are a few additional ones coming up this month from Lean Focus, which is lean management versus lean production, and willpower of women in lean leadership, lessons from the trenches, that are coming up in later this month. With that, I'm going to open it up for questions. Damon?
Okay, thank you, Rob. I have a few questions here that I can read off to you, and let's see your reaction. So the first question is, what are some pitfalls to watch out for when setting up a supplier risk management process?
Yeah, Damon, that's an excellent question. I think there's a couple of basic things that you want to try to avoid. You want to try to avoid creating this in a vacuum. As I mentioned, having that cross-functional team to keep from the second guessing or why you did something or how you rank something higher versus lower in risk is really important. So, I think probably the key there is having that cross-functional team engaged up front as you go through creating the supply management process.
Great, thanks. The next question, how do you balance the expectation for having a low-cost supplier or low-cost supply base with the need to de-risk the supply chain? So I think they're thinking those as like opposing objectives and not being able to coexist.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting question and situation. One typically thinks of lower cost being higher risk. And that's not always the case, to be honest with you. I've seen many cases where your lower cost suppliers actually have lower risk because they're stocking goods or provide vendor managed inventory or things along those lines. So it's really a case by case scenario, and I don't always believe that it's a rule that lower cost suppliers will have higher risk. But obviously, if you take them through the process and you rate them on the scaling you put together, it will help you identify those areas where you do need to address.
Great. This next question is, what are the most likely supplier events to occur that may impact your supply chain? So like, what are the types of disasters and events and things like that that you've seen in your experience?
Well, you only need to look at the recent last 2 years to see several of them, of course, with the pandemic, the war in Europe, of course, labor shortages, the upcoming rail strike. Those kinds of things are in the news every day, whether it be, nature related via fire or hurricanes. Each one depends on, supplier location or, the type of supplier it is or what you're purchasing from them. So, there are just so many potential risks for suppliers. The key is really to prioritize it and to somehow, and to come back with a monetized score of what it really means to have that risk. And so the risk is out there to answer the question. There's too many really to mention, but having preparation or being prepared for when there is a supply interruption is the key.
Okay, thank you. In your experience, how long does it take to stand up a supplier management process in a company?
Good question. So as I spoke just a few slides ago, typically the first go around, if you have a focused Kaizen event of between 4 to 5 days, you can really drive and get a lot of work done. And that's what we would provide to a potential company that wanted to stand up a supply risk management program. After that, as I mentioned also, it can become a little bit, let's say, less intense, but you still want to have the calendar or the cadence of doing, the supply risk during, say, the first quarter, creating the plans during the next quarter, and then implementing those plans, in the latter half of the year, and then repeating that cycle.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about procurement as a function. So apart from procurement, what other functions play a role in the supplier risk management process and in order for it to be successful?
Yeah, great question. There's a number of roles for other functional areas within the companies for dealing with supply risk. Obviously, when you need to qualify other suppliers, you're going to need engineering to create maybe inventory, its operations. But one of the keys too is finance, because many of these things cost money, and so that financing on the team to help with having finance on the team to help with the justification of going out and doing some of the mitigation is really critical. So it really hosts from many different functions within the organization, each playing a separate role within your total strategy.
Okay, the next question. At what point do you actually bring in your supplier to be part of the supplier risk assessment? So it's like involving them in the Kaizen, I think.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question and timing on that. I think sometimes you want to think about them after you've done the assessment, obviously, because you want to prioritize. You don't want to waste their time or your time if they don't fall high in the priority list. But after you've done the assessment, and if they do rank highly as we talked about in the risk categories, there are things that they can do to help reduce risk. So bringing them in during that mitigation phase and explaining to them, why and how we need a particular supplier to react would be very important. And so that would be the timing to do that, not during the assessment itself. It would really be afterwards.
Great. How do you proactively design your supply chain as part of the new product development process to avoid these types of supplier risk from the outset?
Oh, that's a great question, because obviously if you can get rid of the risk from the get-go, then you're that much further ahead. But as I mentioned, things change, so you can't always just forget about it. But one of the real easiest and not easiest, but certainly the area that you want to drive is early involvement in product development. Procurement's involvement in product development to help guide the organization on suppliers that may have higher risk based upon your criteria, and helping the organization understand that and really putting that into the total cost of ownership equation to allow you to make that good supplier selection. But as I mentioned, things do change. So even though you may have brought in a supplier at one point in time that didn't have much risk, as you go through the process in future time periods, you may find that things changed and their risk now has changed. It may have gone up or it's maybe gotten less. So it's always important, if they are one of those top 25 or 20 suppliers within your supply base or very critical to your organization, then keeping tabs on them and doing the assessment on a periodic basis is important.
Okay, I got 3 more questions, submittals here. The next one, could you use a similar type of risk assessment scoring process for your internal suppliers? So like the things that you make internal to your own factory or like a fabrication department, that kind of thing?
Absolutely. In fact, when myself and my team put this together many years ago, it was actually a process that was used internally within the company, and we adapted it to external suppliers. So absolutely.
So this person would like to know some tips for how to sell the idea of the /ROI with this Kaizen workshop to his leadership, his CEO. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, this can be somewhat challenging, but I think we only need to look to our most recent past that if your company has had any disruption in supply and it's impacted revenue to the point of 10 or 15 or 30%, it seems to me that would be a pretty easy justification to say, we're looking to try to put together a program that will help minimize this in the future. And if we do it right and we follow the process, we can reduce our risk on an annual basis, year over year. That will make us more of a robust company to be able to meet our revenue targets. So really using the previous history or past history of supply interruptions to basically sell it forward. Now I will say doing this is somewhat of an insurance policy. So you may want to go to some of your finance folks and ask them how do they justify purchasing certain types of insurance or liability insurance or things along those lines. Because obviously, the key is not to have to use it, but you still have to invest in it. But if you don't have it, it can cost you, literally millions. And so that might be a place to go to help with the justification of that.
Yeah, as a comment, but I don't know what your experience has been, Rob, but mine has been in most organizations, there is a lack of a strategy around the supply chain, the material expense, and in most organizations, it is the number one cost category in the business, yet the level of proactive strategic thinking around how to manage it is either completely absent or suboptimal. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, absolutely. In most companies today are very, let's say, the reverse of linearly integrated. And so, they're outsourcing so many of their processes and maybe just doing final assembly or adding value in some way that's very minimal. In some companies that we've benchmarked, their cost of goods sold can go as high as 80%. But yet they tend not to have strategies around how to deal with 80% of that total cost, and they tend to focus more on the operational side. So, I think if your company's cost of goods sold is over 30%, you really need to try to push that activity around how do we develop that good strategy, robust strategy for making sure that we're always getting what we need when we need it.
All right, so this is like a personal question in your experience. Apart from COVID, what's the biggest supplier risk disaster that you've encountered that you regret not having plans in place for? And if you were to do it all over again, what would you have done differently?
I would say that there was some fires in California about 5 years ago that we really didn't identify as a risk, that there was going to be some shutdowns of factories in Southern California. I think it was about 5 years ago, if I remember correctly. And so, sometimes you can't predict the future, and neither should you be held to predicting the future. But looking at that again, it's really looking at locations and understanding what the potential risk of a given location could be. And at that time, we really didn't think of the fires being a cause of disruption. So, it's again one of these things is if I was able to predict every calamity, I probably would be doing something different. But it's you try to mitigate your risk as much as you can. And with that particular instance, we then in the following year looked at all of our suppliers, not all of our suppliers, but all of our critical suppliers that were in that Southern California area, and said, what do we need to do to make sure we're not overlooking the fact that fire could disrupt the supply chain.
All right. So Rob, that concludes all the questions. One more comment here. Great session from one of the participants. So thank you everybody on the call for your time. We hope you enjoyed the topic. I learned a lot personally. It was very interesting. if you are interested in learning more about us, Lean Focus, you can drop us a line here at info@Lean Focus, and we can direct you to Rob in the procurement practice, or you can just inquire about any other offerings that we may have as an organization. So thanks you again for your time. Thank you, Rob, for presenting this awesome material, and we hope to see you again at one of our upcoming webinars. Take care and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.
Thank you.